All right, so now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Caroline Wood Newhall. Dr. Newhall is an assistant professor of history at Oberlin College. She earned a bachelor's degree in history from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and both a master's and PhD in United States history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She joined the Oberlin College faculty in 2023. Dr. Newhall specializes in 19th century United States history, focusing on North American slavery and captivity, warfare, and the Civil War era. Her publications include numerous blog posts, book reviews, forthcoming book chapters, and a recent contribution to the anthology Race and Gender at War, Writing American Military History, which was published just last month. Newhall's public talks have been featured on C-SPAN and YouTube. Her current research and book project, some of which we'll hear about this evening, explores African American soldiers who became prisoners of war in the Confederacy. And as if that's not enough, she has also been working on a digital database and mapping projects centered on these POWs, genealogies, and their movements throughout the American South. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Newhall.
All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out today. I really appreciate this large crowd, very exciting, love it. So as Amanda mentioned, and I want to give a quick thank you to Liz Schultz for inviting me to come speak here, to Amanda for that lovely introduction, to Arlene and Larry Dunn, and to Jonathan for getting this all set up. I'm very, very excited to be here, so thank you all for being here with me. So yes, my name is Caroline Newhall. I am a historian of slavery, law, and warfare. I quite literally have a class by that name at Oberlin. But I am currently finishing my manuscript on Black soldiers who became prisoners of war in the Confederacy. So that will definitely be the topic for today. But just as a quick background, I have been working on this project in one way or another since about 2009, when I first started doing my undergraduate research at Trinity College. I did work on the military tribunal of the prison commandant of Andersonville Prison, which will be mentioned today, will be featured a little bit. But this was an infamous Confederate prison whose commandant was brought up on charges for war crimes. And there were 4 Black POWs who testified at that trial. So that was kind of my entry point into this topic. And so when I got to this work, I started pulling on that thread, and oh boy, did it go in places I did not anticipate. So I will get into that today. A quick content note on language. I will be sure to explain, terminology. I will make sure when I'm using language like POW, prisoner of war, United States Colored Troops, USCT, I will try and clarify that as I go. But if at any point you find I'm going too quickly or I skipped over something that you didn't quite understand, please feel free to put your hand up and ask me to repeat myself. That does not bother me at all. I will happily do that. I want to make sure you get the full picture of this and where it's going. So I want to open up very quickly with the fact that this is entitled Everything But Death, Black POWs Collective Survival in the Confederate South. This is basically the premise of the book and the research project. One thing I quickly found as I engaged in this project was how frequently the narrative was about death, about mortality, about victimhood. But as I started to do research into these men, and I will talk about that process a little bit today, I found all these various hints that, in fact, there was a much larger rate of survival, a much larger rate of captivity happening in the Confederate South than people had realized. That Black soldiers who were captured by the Confederacy were not simply consigned to execution and death. That was a very real risk. That definitely happened. But on the other side was this incredible series of stories of these individual men working together in order to make it out alive. And one that really struck me was this man named Gilbert Adams. He fought in the 7th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI, Company D. He fought at the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, Virginia, at the end of July in 1864. He and several dozen of his comrades infamously were captured, walked through the streets of Petersburg, taken to Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, and imprisoned there. He doesn't appear on this list, but the list of about 86 men is presented in the Richmond newspapers advertising these men. So Gilbert Adams had a really interesting story. Unfortunately, he does not mention this in some of his firsthand accounts, which I will get to in a little bit. But I thought this was an interesting starting point where he is interviewed in the 1890s about his time as a POW. And he is allegedly taken from this prison, Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, by his former enslaver's son, who was working for the Confederacy. He's a Marylander by birth, so he joins up with the United States Colored Infantry, basically is liberated by this process. He is captured, he is entered into prison. His former enslaver's son allegedly finds him and then puts him up at public auction. And so this incredible newspaper account that I happened upon in the Baltimore Sun, just kind of looking through some names, alleged that this was perhaps the only instance during the war when a man wearing the federal uniform was sold at public sale. As I quickly came to find, that was not true. So, things that we will get into today are challenging these assumptions, current interpretations of Black POWs. As I've mentioned, there's this assumption that a lot of men are basically killed right off, and that definitely happens for a lot of these comrades. But the findings that I was led to through these various records that I will walk you through, finding Black POWs in the records, in the archives, was actually a intensive multi-year process and took me in directions I had never expected. So I will go through those processes for you today, tell you how I found them, where I found them, give you some sense of how to find that yourselves if you're at all interested in following some of these threads. A lot of them are readily available in the public, as well as the experiences of Black captivities, which I make plural because these men went through several iterations of captivity. Most were enslaved in one form or another. I talk about military slavery. I talk about reclamation, which is the process of a former enslaver taking a man back into slavery who had originally enslaved him, military sale, sale by slaveholders, and basically treating these men as war booty. These men were treated as commodities. They were basically treated as slaves regardless of where they came from in one way or another. So we will get into that. But also what is very important about their survival process is community. These men did not survive alone. They did not survive in a vacuum, so I will definitely touch on some of the ways and strategies in which they used long-standing knowledge of surviving under slavery to make it out alive from the war. And this often involved women. It often involved neighborhoods, families. So I will get into some stories there about how these men and women worked together in order to survive. And then if there's time, I'll get into some discussion about conclusions and future avenues of research, but I will pepper those arguments throughout for you. But I would like to start with current interpretations. Now, this is changing over time, but Black POWs have been known about since the war itself. This was never a secret that Black soldiers were being taken prisoner. So out of about 200,000 members of the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, as well as the US Navy, and I will mention the Navy was not segregated to the same degree that the US Army was. Black men were not prohibited from serving in the Navy. I'm not going to talk about POWs in the Navy, but there are some. So if you're curious about that, I can try and give you some sense of that, but my focus is mainly on soldiers. But out of these 200,000, there's really very little knowledge about how many of these men were captured at all. Confederates intentionally did not keep very good records. They often obscured the presence of these men in prisons. And much of the focus that historians have undertaken to find Black POWs has been to focus on military prisons. These are the most visible sites of captivity. So that is a very natural starting point to find these men. As I mentioned, those 4 Black POWs from the Wirtz trial were held at Andersonville Prison, pictured here. Andersonville was infamous. It had more than 40,000 Union POWs pass through its walls. This was an open-air stockade. It opened too early after its first creation, so it was never well organized. They did not have latrines properly set up. Their water supply got polluted very quickly by the bakery that was upstream, as well as excrement from men using it as their toilet, basically. So you can see the massive crowding. And because of the huge, huge numbers of white men men who were taken as prisoners, over 400,000 over the course of the war. That very quickly dwarfs the story of black POWs, who maybe numbered perhaps a dozen to 100 men at a time in these prisons. So they were known about, they were found, we had some individual names, some individual testimonies, but for the most part, historians have really had to focus on kind of isolated pockets of knowledge, basically particular prisons, particular battles where men were taken prisoner. That was the main focus. So if a historian worked on the Battle of Fort Pillow in Tennessee, which is one of the most infamous racial atrocities of the war, there was definitely some work into finding some of these men and understanding where they went. But that is kind of disparate. What was the problem is that I was finding is that we don't have a collective understanding of numbers, of experiences, what's happening to men across time, across space, across different captivity experiences. So that was the impetus for what I was looking for. And it's understandable. So these are white POWs who were held at Andersonville. Very infamously, this was a huge tragedy, almost unbelievable to understand. More than 13,000 men died in Andersonville prison over the course of about a year. This is often compared to images of the Holocaust from concentration camps, as I think you can understand. So these men's narratives flood the American imagination. They are giving voice to what they're going through. They are giving testimony to the United States Sanitary Commission. They are giving voice through the trial. There are more than 150 witnesses at the Wirtz trial. So thinking about that, of the 150 witnesses, just 4 of those are black men who are held prisoner there. So it's just a matter of volume and scale is kind of often the problem with dealing with black POWs. Another issue is black men were going through kind of these same experiences, but we don't have a visual culture for them. For all of the images that we have of white POWs going through these sufferings, giving voice to them, giving the images to this, visual culture, we don't have that comparable narrative for black POWs. If we do have photographs of black POWs, we probably don't know because they were probably dressed as enslaved men. Very few of them were able to hold on to their military uniforms during the war. So I will get into that. But these are some of the challenges that we've been encountering in trying to uncover the narrative of black soldiers. And what's been the main focus has been the moment of capture, very understandably. Black POWs had to be taken in battle. They had to be taken in surrenders, in skirmishes. So this has been very much part of the narrative of trying to find black POWs is understanding what happens to them on the battlefield. So I've pictured Fort Pillow here and Fort Wagner, if anybody's familiar with the movie Glory from 1989. That features the very famous 54th Massachusetts Colored Troops that had 2 sons of Frederick Douglass as members of that regiment, some of the first recipients who were black of Medals of Honor. So all of this basically has contributed to this narrative of basically heroic death and suffering in the moment of encounter. But what happens to those men who do make it to prisons? What happens to men who aren't even reaching prisons at all? And what I found was this was basically a majority of the experiences. So I had to look through a multiple set of resources. So first and foremost, I started looking through the official records of the Union and Confederate navies and armies. If anybody's ever used those are publicly available, by the way, on the internet. So if you want to go look through, everything's organized by date, by region. So you can put in keywords, you can search through the indexes to your heart's desire. This was where I started. I basically found that most historians understood perhaps 800 black soldiers were taken prisoner over the course of the war. These were men who survived to make it to 9 prisons. What I found as I went through, however, and started going through the service records of these soldiers was that the experiences were actually a little more diffuse than was initially understood. So pictured here, I just want to point out on the left-hand side is one of these testimonies from the Wirtz trial. The Wirtz trial is also publicly available. You can search for that. So Frank Maddox actually went by Mardix, and I think this is because of his heavy North Carolina accent. His enslaver was named John Mattix with an M-A-T-T-O-C-K-S. He went by Mardix, M-A-R-D-I-X, when he applied for a pension, which I'll get into the pensions in a second. It's miswritten as Maddox, so this is another one of those issues kind of confronting historians and researchers trying to understand what these men went through, because so many are not literate. Tracing their names through the records can actually be quite a process. But he gives a really interesting set of testimonies in the Wirtz trial, so that is an image of that there. But newspapers were a great starting point, so I showed you that opening image from Gilbert Adams, talking about his captivity experience in 1893. This is an image, the Local Matters newspaper clipping. You can find this on newspapers.com. I believe you can find it on Chronicling America. I would not have been able to do most of this research without basically being able to cross-reference and collate a lot of different databases, which I'll get into as I move forward. But this is listing a number of Gilbert Adams' comrades who are held in a prison named Castle Thunder in Richmond, who are basically being advertised for reclamation by their enslavers in the areas. So giving the names of these men by their first names, not their last, but the full names of their enslavers and where their enslavers live. So these are all traces through the historical record that I started with. But that was only so much that I could work with. I was very interested in not only understanding how many men were captured, but also what they had to say about it, which leads me to some of my next 2 points. So the official records here has a whopping total of another 4 testimonies by Black POWs. So in total, across all of the printed work that I found in the official records and these trial transcripts, we have about 8 individual voices by Black POWs. So very, very hard to find what they're going through. They're very helpful. They definitely bring a lot of information to the surface. This is a man from the 44th United States Colored Infantry who was captured along with about 600 men in the fall of 1864 in this en masse surrender to General Nathan Bedford Forrest in 1864 after Fort Pillow. Forrest was involved in the massacre at Fort Pillow, so people have been confused as to why he took this large number of men captive. And basically, my thinking is they are desperate for labor in late 1864. These men are funneled down into Mobile, Alabama, which I will get into. But he's giving some voice to these experiences, but he makes it back to federal lines very quickly. He's only captive for a couple of days. So he also isn't giving us the full picture of what's going on with Black POWs. We get some sense, we get the capture, we get the captivity for a brief while, forced labor, abuse by the guards, but that doesn't give us the understanding of the men who are in captivity for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years. So what I had to do, and I'm going to get into this in some depth for you all, is go into the Memorandum from Prisoners of War Records. So that's pictured up here. I'll give you a nice close-up of that. So these are in the compiled military service records of basically every United States colored troop. They don't have the memoranda, but you can go into the compiled military service records on a site called fold3.com if anybody's familiar with ancestry.com. They have a military wing which has a lot of records for soldiers and people involved with the armed forces. They've actually scanned most of the United States colored troops records. So what did I do? Well, I set myself up for a lot of pain, a lot of tedium, but it was worth it. So I went through about 50 regiments records, close to 10,000 men total. There were POWs I could identify in about 40 of those regiments, so I spent a lot of time just spinning my wheels looking for men. But every so often, I would see a slip like this, the Memorandum from Military Service Records, Memorandum from Prisoner of War Records, excuse me. And as soon as I took a note of that, I threw it in a database, and I basically kept track of it. And you can see there's, again, some tantalizing information here. This is James Ottaway. He is captured with the 111th United States Colored Infantry, so you can see, his rank, his regiment there, that information. But he's captured at Sulphur Trestle, Alabama, September 25th, 1864. These are those captures with Nathan Bedford Forrest, and held by a rebel Captain Scoff at work on his plantation in West Tennessee until December 27th, 1865. So not only is he held captive, not only is he made a POW, not only is he basically enslaved by a Confederate officer, he is held captive until well after the war's end. This is going to happen with several men who are basically forced into these situations when he escaped. So he finally escapes in December 1865. this was actually not rare, as I very quickly came to find. And so part of the issue that I'd confronted with just limiting my scope to prisons really expanded when I looked at many more arenas, namely Confederate camps, places where there were camps of instruction, places that basically went beyond battlefields. And these compiled military service records give a lot of these details, basically where men were held, where they were transported. If anybody's at all familiar with the railway lines of the Confederacy, and I'm sorry I don't have an image of that up here, I just realized I should have done that, but you will notice that there are movements of these men along these railway lines, very much in line with what the internal slave trade did throughout the antebellum period. So these men were taken along mature routes of the slave trade. They were delivered to areas where they were needed. And you can see there's a pretty big scatter shot of where these men were held. So I found that they were not only just held in 9 prisons of the Confederacy, they were held in pretty much every state of the Confederacy. They did labor in pretty much every state of the Confederacy. Some were sold from a couple of states by Confederate officers. Some were personally enslaved by Confederate officers. Most were put to what I call military slavery. So over the course of my research, I uncovered more than 2,200 names. So that original estimate of 800 men quickly spiraled outward the longer I looked through these records. So of those 2,200 men, I have found that about 70% survived. So that's still a devastating mortality rate. 30% is more than double what white POWs suffered during the Civil War. They averaged a mortality rate of about 11 to 14%, depending on where they were. And take that with a grain of salt, because places like Andersonville had catastrophically high mortality rates as well. Somewhat ironically, the black POWs at Andersonville had a much higher survival rate compared to the white POWs. And in part, it's because they were put to work. They were taken out of the prison. They were used as military labor to build structures, to bury the dead. So in some ways, this forced military enslavement could provide some shelter to these men from some of the sufferings of basically being confined in a small space for 2 years at a time. So what I found really kind of shocked me, and this is a little map that I threw together using geographic information systems known as ESRI. QGIS is how I put this together, so if anyone has questions about that, I will happily answer questions. But what I found was that the locus, the center of black captivity, was not necessarily urban spaces like Richmond, though that was definitely one of them. Actually got centered down in Mobile towards the end of the war. Most of these men, close to 1,000 out of these 2,200 alone, end up in Mobile by the end of 1864 because the Confederacy is faltering. General Dabney H. Maury is running the Department of the Gulf. And it turns out he is absolutely desperate because slaveholders will no longer send enslaved labor to support the Confederacy at this point. They are doing what's called refugeeing their slaves to other states, basically protecting them from the reach of the Confederacy. Because they think slavery will survive even if the Confederacy does not. So they're trying to keep their investments intact. And this creates a huge problem for Maury, for his chief engineer, Alfred von Schellaha, who's trying to keep the battlements and the fortifications in Mobile functional. Unfortunately for Dabney and for Schellaha, David Farragut, famous admiral of the US Navy, has already attacked some of the fortifications in Mobile in August 1864, and these fortifications are not made for Civil War guns. They can perhaps stand up to guns from 1812, because that's when they were built. So these old structures have not been built up. Schellaha is desperate, just absolutely desperate for labor, and he's not getting it. The governor of Alabama is not helping them. It's just like, just go to the salt mines and take these men. So what happens is Maury gives a directive to General Forrest, as well as to Confederate General John Bell Hood, and tells them, we need black labor. We need black bodies. And what do? They find that in the form of black soldiers who are basically doing guard duty along the railways of the South. They're protecting Sherman's march through the South, cutting down through Alabama and Georgia, and they're basically kind of trying to prohibit the Confederacy from standing against Sherman. So this is where these windfalls of men are coming, and they end up in some surprising places. So in Mobile, they will be put to very different forms of labor, but I will get to this point in just a second. I do want to mention the Civil War pensions, however. The Civil War pensions are where I got all of this testimony. I found firsthand accounts from these men, details about where they were held, the labor they performed, who enslaved them, details on men like Captain Scoff, who held them to military slavery. And I found 719 survivors. I collected about 360 pensions. And then these men would sometimes, not as much as I would like, gave their testimonies in affidavits and depositions like this. So they would talk about their experiences, and you would see incredible things like men being treated as war booty, as basically prizes to be held. And this I've already mentioned, but you can find some of these moments in the official records. So Henry McCulloch, he's talking about gifting black POWs to Confederate soldiers as basically rewards for their good behavior in the battles. Private Charles Sissel upholds this in his pension file, in his affidavits. He says that he was taken prisoner by his captor, who said, "If you cure him, he will make me a good servant." So not only do we have men intentionally kept alive, they're also given some medical treatment. They're intentionally kept functional. And so there is a whole kind of commerce happening around this. So these are some of the spaces where men were held, but I know we are running slightly low on time, so I'll move forward. But military enslavement was the #1 impetus for taking black POWs alive. So as I mentioned, Mobile, the Mobile Papers of Sunday published a long list of Negroes employed by the government in that city. General Maury requests the owners to present their claims for settlement. So you're not getting enslaved people back if they are found with the POWs, because we're using them, but we will remunerate you for them. So this kind of long-standing function basically continues. Yes?
My question is, are you assuming that all of these blacks were former slaves? Because I know
Ooh.
there was a huge amount of
Yeah.
Emancipation Proclamation was announced.
Mm-hmm.
People from the North going down to join.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a fantastic question. Absolutely. So the question was, how many of these men were formerly enslaved? Am I assuming that they were all formerly enslaved? And the answer is no. A lot of men definitely were coming from the North. They are generally held in these prisons in kind of a legal limbo. So men from the 54th Massachusetts, the governor of South Carolina does not know what to do with them. And neither really does the Confederate government, in part because Lincoln has passed a retaliatory order in July of 1863, basically saying if you treat black soldiers as anything other than soldiers, you know, as something other than POWs, we will retaliate in kind. That doesn't quite happen, but it does give the Confederacy pause, so they hold a lot of the freemen kind of in this legal limbo where they're not going to be exchanged, but they are imprisoned. So that's definitely a great question. The men who are being put to labor are, by and large, formerly enslaved, though there are a couple of weird instances, which I can answer in the Q&A about that, but that's a fantastic question, thank you. So yeah, men are put to work on docks, they are put to work on railroads, in salt mines, a couple are sold, at least 16 men were sold from military prisons. So not just Gilbert Adams, but several of his comrades. Richard Johnson was actually enslaved by a man named, I'm blanking out on his first name, somebody Lloyd, but who was the nephew of General Edward Lloyd, who had enslaved Frederick Douglass before he was emancipated. So a lot of these interesting connections between these personal groups. But I do want to end on a story of reclamation, which I think is kind of the key as to thinking about this community and what happens. So a man named Private Abram Rawls was reclaimed by his former enslaver, a man named Dr. John Perkins Rawls, who actually served in the Confederate Congress from Alabama. He was from Gadsden, had been his whole life. Rawls and Private Rawls and Dr. Rawls had a very contentious relationship. He's brought back to the Rawls farm and basically plays a part. He's giving this amazing testimony because he and his enslaver, his former enslaver, are communicating after the war in 1892, so Abram can get a pension. And basically, he plays a good role. He says, "My dear old master," and "Do you remember your boy Abram?" So he's giving this kind of language to get Rawls on his side to basically give good testimony for him, which he does, interestingly enough, and we can explore that in the Q&A if anyone's curious. But basically what happens in the Confederacy is that men like Rawls really do want to undo the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. They want to undo what military service has enabled black men to be capable of, which is to potentially become United States citizens, which is to be legitimate combatants under the laws of war. So what I'm very much arguing in this book is that the Confederates really wanted to unmake the soldier and remake the slave. And this is part of why we do not get to see many black POWs in the visual culture or the written culture of the Civil War. This is a famous image of Private Hubbard Pryor of the 44th United States Colored Infantry. You can find this anywhere. He's very well known. He becomes a POW, actually, along with several men in the 44th, including Abram Rawls. And usually you'll see this image reversed. He starts off in his slave clothes, as it were, and then he's basically granted, as contemporary observers called civilized, basically by the influence of the United States military. By putting on this uniform, he becomes a man, he becomes a citizen, he's standing upright, he's proud. That's the typical narrative associated with this image. What Rawls, Dr. Rawls, and what the Confederate government really want to do is reverse that. Unmake the soldier, remake the slave. And they can do that by executing these men, but they can also do it by making use of these men. Meanwhile, these men are undergoing incredible, basically, means of survival, and that includes enslaved women, it includes their communities. So a man like Private Abram Rawls is actually somewhat fortunate. He faces a ton of danger going back into Dr. Rawls's authority, because he's no longer under the oversight of the military or the Confederate government. He's now quite vulnerable. This is now a one-on-one relationship that he has to navigate. But he is stripped of his uniform on the way back to the Rawls farm from Gadsden, Alabama, after being identified and reclaimed. And he encounters this woman named Sarah Jane Hunter, who is a refugee from Tennessee. She's one of those enslaved people who's been sent down into another state by her enslaver to escape basically being impressed by the US military and by the Confederate military. And she says an interesting thing. She and Rawls later establish a connection while he's back in captivity under Dr. Rawls, and they get married. So Dr. Rawls permits this marriage between Abram Rawls and this woman, Sarah Jane Hunter. They establish a relationship. Later, Sarah Jane Hunter is taken back into Tennessee. Rawls discovers, and he just follows her. He has a pass to go see her every weekend, so he's gotten privileges back. He has gotten back in the good graces of Dr. Rawls, despite being found with the US military. And there's something really curious in their pension file, where she is affirming that she remembers Rawls's regiment, she remembers his military service, because he, when he was brought back, his clothes were exchanged, his bluer soldier clothes for jeans. As Dr. Rawls said, he did not want to take Abram back home in his soldier clothes. I know this because I was the person that gave the clothes to Mr. Rawls. And the pension agent asks, how do you know that? Well, says Sarah Jane Hunter Rawls, we have the belt buckle somewhere here now. How do they have the belt buckle if she got rid of his soldier clothes, if she was the one who took them? I think she held on to it. I think she performed a little act of defiance in this very tense moment where they didn't dare speak to one another. That's something she says. They couldn't dare speak to one another because they would have both been in terrible, terrible trouble and danger. And so they maintain this connection. They get married. Abram Rawls manages to maneuver through enslavement back on the Rawls farm, and they escape together and spend the rest of their lives together in Tennessee and then Kansas. So this leads me to basically how we're challenging the narrative here. And I wanted to show you an image that I found in the pensions. So as I said, the visual culture of POWs is pretty much non-existent during the war. There is a visual culture of survival, however. There are photographs of these men who became pensioners, who survived, who got their photographs taken after the war to show that they were who they said they were. They don't have birth certificates, they don't have marriage certificates. Those records have not been kept if they were in slavery. So a man like Richard French, who was from Alabama, is enslaved during the war as a military slave in Mobile. He gets to take a picture in, and you can't really see it here, but he's got a little thing embroidered on his jacket, GAR. He's a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. So he is now older, he has gray hair, he has survived, he has come out the other side. He's not only outlived slavery, he's outlived the Confederacy. So long story short, basically, that is what I am trying to uncover with these men's experiences, that far more men were taken prisoner than we realize, far more survived than we realize, and not only did they do that, they did it together, they did it with their communities, they gave voice to this, and we can find out incredible information like genealogical histories. We can find names of grandparents, of children, of brothers, cousins, aunts, and I've started to do some of that and try and map it out. So this is basically the process moving forward, and I know we're starting to run out of time, so I want to make sure we have time for questions, but there are a lot more stories I could tell, so if you want to ask those, we can definitely get into that. But Abram Rawls was the longest, by far, pension file I ever found, and I will say pension files are incredible. They're made for a very particular purpose, where these men are applying to get restitution from the United States government because they've lost their ability to perform physical labor to some degree. Their military service means they've been wounded, they have debilitating chronic illnesses, so they need some support, and the US is stepping in to help them with that. So much of their testimony is centered on that. So if they were captured in, say, the Battle of Fort Pillow and they lost an arm, that's kind of an open and shut case. So when I find a pension file like that, even if they were a POW, they might not talk about their experience in captivity all that much if they made it out of that experience, without any further injuries. Men, however, who, like Abram Rawls, found that they had to do a few extra steps to get their pensions. With Abram Rawls, it was discovered that somebody had actually been collecting a pension in his name for 20 years. No one knew. People were committing fraud rampantly right and left, which is part of why the Pension Bureau came under a lot of fire in the late 19th century. But it was a one-armed man from his neighborhood who knew that Abram and a bunch of other enslaved men from the area had been taken prisoner, had been returned to their enslavers. Many had been killed by their enslavers, and that's something that Rawls says. So Anderson Garrett got people around him to testify he was Abram Rawls, thinking Abram Rawls was dead, not knowing Abram Rawls had escaped into another state. The pension examiners were furious. They found this out when the real Abram, applied in 1890 after this new law had been passed, and I can address that if anybody's interested. But basically, Abram had to communicate exactly what happened to him, who he was. He had letters back and forth with with Dr. Rawls, I should say. So to go back to that image, he'd been in hiding from Dr. Rawls for decades because Dr. Rawls had threatened to kill him again for his escape. When he absconded, he tricked a Confederate Confederate patrol, I should say, a police patrol around the area, showed them his pass, and basically was hiding in the woods when Dr. Rawls rode up with some comrades and basically was making horrible, horrible threats. So Abram Rawls also had to make yet another sacrifice where he never went back home. He never communicated with his family. He left his mother behind, his brothers and sisters. So that sacrifice still continued well after the war. But they actually reestablished a connection, and I got a lot of personal details about the roles that Abram had served under Dr. Rawls. Like, he'd assisted him in medical care and things like that. So the ability to find information about these men, as personalities, as people with lives, with children, with senses of humor, with criminal records, what have you, very, very strong religious beliefs as well, come out in very incredible ways in the pension records. Not always as much as you would like, but casting a wide net, getting those hundreds of files really enabled me to get a much more collective sense of who these men were. So just to recenter back to Hubbard Pryor and Richard French, I would say Richard French and Hubbard Pryor are basically kind of the best examples we have of what Black POWs went through, and that they did fight. They did survive as best they could. They did it together. They did it in common, and so many, 70% of these men managed to outlast the Confederacy itself. So with that, I will say thank you so much. Here is my contact information. So anything we don't get to after this talk, we can talk about one-on-one via email. But yes, I would love to answer any questions. I'm sure there are some at least. I barely scratched the surface of this, so. Yes.
How successful were these men in securing favorable Decisions from the pension board.
That is a great question. So the pensions are fascinating because they vary from year to year. So if anybody's familiar with this, it's a really interesting story. So pensions from the federal government are allowed as early as 1862 for people who have been provably injured in battle. So you have to have a wartime injury that you can prove. So for a lot of the men who are present for battles, say Fort Pillow, say the Battle of the Crater, they tend to have an easier time. Their success rates, I don't remember off the top of my head, I mapped this out at one point, but they have about a 60 to 80% success rate, which I'm not totally sure how much that compares to, say, white POWs or white soldiers. I would have to look back into that. But they do pretty well because it's very obvious that they've been wounded the way they say they were. If you have, a shell wound, for example, if you have wounds from bayonets, that's a lot easier to prove than, say, if you just have had dysentery and you're trying to show when that occurred. And especially for black POWs, they have the burden of not only not having birth records, marriage records, etc. They're quite often separated from one another, from their officers. So if you don't have the testimony of two officers, you have to go into a lot more depth of getting your community to basically give testimony for you. After 1890, this gets complicated because the government basically waives wartime wounds and injuries as a pensionable thing. You can just get a pension if you have some debility, and you can prove that you were a veteran. But there's still some racism for sure in how the pension agents are maneuvering this, and they're very skeptical of black soldiers and skeptical of just black men in general. So having an Anderson Garrett who has defrauded the government for 20 years in the name of Abram Rawls does not do much for black soldiers' cause, unfortunately, in the post-war. So there are people kind of, making use of that and taking advantage. But they're more successful than I expected. I believe it got close to about 80% success rate at various times that I've looked at. But yeah, that was some research I did in the weeds when I was doing my dissertation. It's been a few years, so I don't remember the exact amount. But thank you. Thank you for that question. Oh, yes.
This is a little off the subject, but I was curious if you came across any discussion of the, especially among the slaves in the South, of the Emancipation Proclamation. Did they actually know they were emancipated? Did formally, did the enslavers know that this had happened in the North?
Oh, yes. Oh, the enslavers knew. Boy, oh boy, did they know, and they were terrified of it. Actually, Sarah Jane Hunter Rawls and Abram Rawls had no idea that, Abram Rawls knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, but they actually didn't know that the war had ended, that slavery had been ended in areas of like Tennessee, for example. So news trickles through in different ways, but there are men like James Ottaway who are held well after the war ends to slavery. There are some men I found who are put to work in coal mines in Alabama well until after the war ends. So in fits and starts, people realize, but I think enslaved people are generally pretty well informed, even if they don't know the exact legalese of it or the scope. The enslavers know, so they know. I mean, they have ears and eyes everywhere, and that's part of the tension of the South, is that there's this kind of, restive population that's always looking for a way out, always looking for chances at liberty. And so Abraham Lincoln takes on these amazing epic proportions where people are claiming he's like visiting them in the night and telling them to go free, like they've been freed by him. So this interesting kind of religious association with Lincoln, he kind of takes on this spiritual level. So they know, even if they don't know, like the limits of the Emancipation Proclamation, and they take advantage of that where they can. A lot can't. That's the sad reality. Like people in the interior are really kind of hemmed in, and it takes the sweeping through of people like Sherman, of other raids, by Strait et al., to make it more possible. But it's generally people restricted to waterways and places in the upper South to take advantage of it. So people in the deep South and the interior have a much harder time, for sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
The fraudulent Rawls
Yes.
were he or the group that were supporting that ever prosecuted? Was there anything coming out of it?
That's a great question. I don't know. I didn't follow that through. There is a legal arm of the Pension Bureau, however, that does try to get back pay, for example. If they find instances of fraud, they try to get it back where they can. There is a case I saw of a man who was repeatedly applying for increases to his pension. He didn't think he was rated highly enough. And he basically gets penalized by the Pension Bureau because they think he's exaggerating and that he's been kind of committing fraud by exaggerating his wound. So they actually go after him for restitution. That's just one case I've found. I don't know for sure how widespread that is, but the Pension Bureau is a force to be reckoned with by the end of the 19th century. It's massive. It's something like 40% of the entire budget of the United States government goes towards the Pension Bureau by the end of the 19th century. So Civil War veterans have quite a lot of pull with the government, and that is a major consideration in the kind of politicking between Republicans and Democrats at this point. So great question. I'm not totally sure, but I know that is definitely happening. They're going after people where they can. There are fraudulent pension attorneys who are, trying to collect more funds than they should. They get a flat rate of like $10 for every case that they file, and they're sometimes basically defrauding their clients and getting more money from them than they should. So there's a whole legal wing basically dedicated to this. So I imagine there are some good cases out there. Dora Costa has gotten into this. There's a huge pension historiography out there that's definitely worth looking into. It's really fascinating stuff, but yeah, a little beyond my scope, sadly.
So you showed a record. I'm not sure if this was Abram Rawls's record of where I thought that was a Army record, but it showed in there that the person escaped.
Ooh, yes. So there were several hundred escapes at least.
Yeah. So how does the military find out that a person escaped enslavement? And how many of those escapees survived and made it to real freedom?
Great question. At least 400 men, I found, were able to escape. Interestingly enough, one of the first major captures in the war is after a couple of battles in Louisiana, the Battle of Milliken's Bend and the Battle of the Mound Plantation. And most of these men actually escape within the first few months of their captivity. It's incredible. I don't really know what's going on there. I think maybe the oversight was pretty bad by their captors. And there were a lot of men who were captured together from the same plantations, from the same kin groups. They were friends, they were family. So they really supported each other through escape, and most of those men do make it back. So those escapes are very successful. There's an instance Abram Rawls talks about, and a couple of his comrades talk about, where there's a mass attempted escape by about 20 men, and most of them are killed. They escape to a river, but some of them can't swim. They're basically shot while they're trying to get across the way. There's only one survivor, and he actually testifies for Rawls's case. So it's kind of impossible to know. I'm sure there were countless escapes that were not successful that we'll just never know about. Some of them do get talked about. Men who are killed on the forced march to and from capture to their first place of captivity. That happens frequently. Men who escape by tunneling out or by making runs for it while they're on burial duty. But for the most part, it's kind of impossible to know a full accounting. So I've done as much as I can, but I've gotten about 370 names of men who say they escaped, or they were recorded by the United States Army, because the U.S. still had, presence in the South well after the war, right, throughout Reconstruction. So these men do make it back to their regiments, or they make it back to other regiments. These get filtered through. The U.S. Army takes, records of it. So some of these are actually filled out after the war, after they've made it back. So yeah, that's how this ends up. There's something called the Prisoner of War book, which I would love to find. I haven't found that yet, but basically these memoranda are just kind of the bread and butter of what I'm finding. So these are generally officers confirming these details, men who've survived, reports from men who survived, and talking about men who didn't survive. So all of this kind of oral reporting basically gets codified later. Yeah.
Have you located any modern people who are living who remember or have connections back to any of these names?
A couple, yes.
Families,
They
yeah.
they found me, quite thankfully. There was a woman whose ancestor fought at Fort Pillow, and she was just curious if he was on my list. She knew some things about it, but not all. She didn't know that he had a pension, so I directed that her way. I haven't heard from too many descendants yet, and that is kind of beyond me at the moment. That's something I would really love to do more of, is get in touch with as many descendants as possible. And the whole kind of idea behind the database and making this readily accessible is that people can access this for free. Like I can't tell you how much money I spent belonging to Ancestry.com, to Fold3, to getting financing to go to the archives and collect these 360 pensions. So I have copies too. So if anybody wants photocopies, I will definitely try and send them to people. So I've heard from a couple of descendants, but most have no idea. So I'm hoping getting that word out there will spread some more kind of knowledge about these men. But yeah, a lot of that gets lost. It's much harder to keep records. If you're living in poverty, which most of these men do, a vast majority, Rawls included, I mean, they die poor. They are not making a whole lot of money from their pensions by any means, and they're surviving by physical labor. So that's quite tough if they're not able to make the same wage as they could before the war when they were fully able-bodied. But yeah, that's a great question. Yes.
I think we'll just do these last two.
Sure.
One in the back, one here, and then I think Dina. Yeah, can you stay after
Oh,
those
yes,
three?
please.
Then? All right. So back first.
Hi. I was just wondering, you said the initial estimate by historians was 800,
Mhm.
and that was very low, and that throughout your research you found 2,200 confirmed names, cases. Do you have an estimate at this point of how many there may have been, more than even the confirmed cases you have now?
Ooh, I think at least 24 to 2,600. There's another actually scholar who independently had gone through the CMSR. He unfortunately is not a like academic historian. He's a private historian, and he actually published that list, but it's no longer available, sadly. So I need to get in touch with him at some point. But he estimated about 2,600. There were another couple hundred sailors who were also captured as well, so I add them to that number. Sailors were captured in much smaller numbers, though, because they're not in a massive land force. They're landing in very small numbers. They're captured in small numbers. They're very few to a white crew, generally. It's not like they're all black crews really working during the war. So yeah, that's a great question. I'm not totally sure. There are 155 total USCT regiments, and there are definitely ones I haven't gotten to yet that were involved in battles. So I know there are more out there. It's just a matter of having the time and resources to do that. So any interested students who would like to do that research and get a little money for it, help. This is ongoing. Yeah, I'm going to keep filling this out. So even that 2,200, it's at 2,270 right now, and I keep finding new men every so often who I've overlooked from things or who I go back and find in the records. So there's definitely more to be found. So I'm even just scratching the surface. So yeah, thank you.
I wondered if you had any specific data on the Ohio regiment.
Sadly, no. I was looking into that. I have about 15 men who were born in Ohio who are captured. So from the 5th United States Colored Infantry, a couple of men from the 54th Massachusetts. For the most part, I haven't looked specifically into that, though. Most of the men I've looked into are from the slave states. So there's still more to be done with that, too, for sure. I was most curious about formerly enslaved men who were returned to slavery. So at a certain point, I wasn't looking so much at the free regiments. So that's definitely worth looking into. And I wish I had a better answer for you on that one. TBD. I'll get to it. I promise. Thank you.
How many of those men were literate?
Oh, yes. How many were literate? That's a great question. No idea. Literacy rates for black soldiers were generally quite low, especially for formerly enslaved men. And about 78% of the entire USCT is formerly enslaved. So there are estimates of maybe 10% of the total force, and definitely these men are getting educated as they're rising through the ranks as non-commissioned officers. Like, these men are sergeants, they're corporals, they're rising through the ranks as much as they can, though they do not get commissioned officer positions. That would be a bridge too far at this point. So they are learning some skills, but for the most part, most are definitely not literate. So yes, that's a great point. I should have mentioned at the beginning is that out of all of the 400,000 white POWs of the war, we have maybe 150 white POW narratives that got published. We don't have any of those for black POWs. They don't have the same resources. They definitely don't have the same literacy rates. So that's another level of complication with the pension files, is that this is also oral testimony that's being written down by someone else. So it's not even always exactly their wording, though they sometimes do get directly quoted, which is always fun to find. But a lot of it's kind of, summarizing, paraphrasing. It gets really complicated with black soldiers especially. But that's also an issue for white soldiers too. A lot of white soldiers are also not literate, but it's much smaller number. I think maybe 10 to 20% of white men were not literate by the Civil War. Don't quote me on that. Men are not my focus, sadly. I don't know. But yes, that's a great question. Thank you.
Well, I think let's all give Dr. Wood Newhall a
Thank you
round of
so much.
applause.
And yes, I will stay up here, so come talk to me.
Thank you so
And
much for the
yes,
wonderful program.
thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight.
And yes, if you want to email me, get in touch with me, you can use my email address here or just find me on the internet, shoot me an email. I will definitely get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But yes, thank you so, so much. Really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.